Hey guys, if you're shopping for knives and gear, make sure you check out the description of the video you're watching right now for links to some great online retailers. There's also individual links for knives that I personally recommend. Thanks! What's going on YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I've got an updated top 20 list of my favorite folding knives of all time. Haven't you done this before? Yeah, I definitely have, in many different forms. I've done, top 10 in different price ranges, top 15 considering utility and value. The last time I did my top 20, it was actually a top 15 video of my favorite folding knives of all time, was actually almost a year ago. And what do I mean by that? I mean not considering the price tag and not considering function, which are my favorite folding knives, the ones that have brought me the most joy without being able to explain exactly what that is. The folding knives that have brought me the most joy. That's what this video is. This is my opinion, and they are my favorites, so I can't be wrong. Your top 20 list might be a little bit different than mine, and that's totally fine. But out of all the knives that I have handled on this channel, every single one of these will have full reviews or overviews or both on this channel, right? These are my top 20 as of right now, which is, we're actually into August of 2020 by the time you guys see this video. So, follow me on Instagram. Check out my Patreon. There is a link down in the description. The support would mean the world to me. Let's go ahead and get into these. These are not in any particular order. The Rockstead Hego2. Oh my goodness, this knife is expensive, but it is the overall combination of the materials and the aesthetics, right? Now, this is, in this case, I believe it's mirror polish ZDP 189, and then we have this interesting, it looks like G10, it's actually carbon fiber in a very interesting form. And then they are shadow boxed by these beautiful polished blue anodized titanium liners. This has a really hydraulic action and has the cool zero edge, right? And this is why I leave, when I talk about my favorites, I leave price out of this. This was not my knife. A lot of the knives that actually are on this list are knives that I have handled on the channel, where you can go back and watch the video. If you don't like the screen recorded stuff, that's perfectly fine. This knife was not mine, and I couldn't afford this knife. This is a $1,500, $1,600 knife, but just being able to handle it and experience it, objectively, I realized this knife brings me so much joy. Imagining having the funds to purchase it, right, and not having to worry about that. Would this object bring me joy? And yes, it does. On top of that, I mean, if I were to use it, it would be a wonderfully functional tool. It's the mirror polish blade is just excellent. This is one of those things where having it in hand made me realize, like, I would always look at Rocksteads and think, how could they possibly cost that much money, right? That's what people are thinking when they hear $1,500, $1,600, or maybe just $100 or $200. How could a knife possibly cost that much money? I'm not going to say it makes absolute sense to everybody, but this knife, once I handled it, I was like, oh, I should really be wearing gloves. This is such a beautiful, pristine, just precision-made object. It is wonderful. Many of these knives you will be able to buy, in which case I will provide links down in the description. And if you use those links, of course, it does benefit the channel. But not all of these knives you can buy. That is not the main idea with my channel. I'm not always trying to get people to click on links. I do always give my honest thoughts, and so yeah, that is going to be the case with this video. But yeah, honestly, the Rockstead Hego2, wonderful. Moving on here, a less expensive knife, but one that is absolutely expensive. This is the Microtech Combat Troodon in the Hellhound blade, the Signature Series. This is a gigantic OTF, so right there, cool factor. On top of that, we have the Signature Series or hand ground 204P Hellhound blade. Oh God, this thing is wicked. I own this knife. My wife gave this to me as a Christmas gift, and I constantly play with it. My love for this thing has not gone away. This is my ideal version of the Combat Troodon. Yes, I know there are customs that are shinier, more expensive, blah, 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 blah. But this is just, as far as knives that I have handled go, yeah, this does it for me. This really, every time I pick this thing up and fire it, it's awesome. If you've never handled a Combat Troodon, oh my gosh, the power of that blade coming out, it's just ridiculous. I love this thing. Moving on here, sorry for the bad quality in this picture. I actually had to rip this off of my own Instagram. The Riot Jack in Damasteel. This was the first integral, however you want me to say that, knife that I ever owned. I intentionally sought this out on blade forums after realizing I could not buy this version of it brand new anymore. These came in M390, and then you had an option for damage steel if you wanted to pay some more money. They also had different, they had like a plain titanium frame, or you could get the flame titanium. That's what I specifically wanted, flame titanium and this damage steel blade, and I picked it up. This is expensive. I think these originally came in at like 650 some. I think I picked mine up on the secondary market for like 500-ish. All right, price aside, wonderful. Big, heavy, just the presentation of this thing was insane. And I've always been interested in integral knives. And anybody who doesn't know what that means, it means the titanium scales are actually all one piece of titanium rather than being two pieces that are being held together in a pillar construction or with a backspacer, which just adds to the intrigue. It's not necessarily an upgrade in potential strength or utility. It's just interesting because there's more precision that is involved with getting something like that right than a sandwich or pillar construction titanium frame lock. This was actually a sub frame lock with overlays because of the way the positioning of the marble carbon fiber. Anyways, crazy. Double harpoon / clip point, whatever you want to call it. I love this knife. Moving on here, the Steelcraft series Bodega. So I've handled a field grade Bodega. It was pretty cool. I'm sure the custom Bodegas are much better. I actually have handled many Beg customs, but I can't deny that Riot's, production versions of these Beg series, and this was a direct collaboration between Beg Knives and Riot to create this, essentially to bring a lot of these really popular custom designs into a more affordable, production knife. And this was insane. A lot of people will say it was very difficult to distinguish between this version and the actual Bodega. And while, again, I'm sure the custom is substantially better, this was wonderful. It allowed me to experience this knife for, I can't remember what these were. When I picked this up, it was like $350 or something like that. S35VN, bearings, titanium, steel lock bar insert, which was not something that comes in the original Bodega. They had the entire lock could be removed, but it was not the lock bar insert, which is easier and less expensive from a manufacturing standpoint. Anyways, I love this. Satin finished blade and that textured titanium handle scale. Love this knife. This is ergonomically, it's one of my favorite designs ever, and I love the aggressive fuller and just the shape of that harpoon blade. Wonderful knife. Moving on here, the Chavez Redemption 229 Ultramar, another knife that originally was an American mid-tech and custom, and I believe he still makes these, but this was actually, if I'm not mistaken, this was actually a collaboration between Ramon Chavez and Riot again. So again, I mean, there are multiple Riots on this list, guys. I mean, a lot of the knives on this list are made in the United States, but I just can't deny Riot's quality, and they do such a good job of bringing some amazing designs that would otherwise be exclusive to the upper tiers of the custom knife world. They bring all that quality, but they allow people to get their hands on them for much less money. And these were, now this was a special variant that I handled, but I want to say these were between $400 and $500. Oh my gosh, I love the look. I love the kind of the boxy, squared, aggressive look, and of course the pocket clip. If you're wondering, yeah, I am into that pocket clip. Not seeing it here. It's this big skull looking thing. People either love it or they hate it. I think it adds character to this knife, and it's instantly recognizable. I always know exactly what I'm looking at with this thing. Just ridiculously cool. Moving on here, one of the less expensive knives on the list, the A. Purvis or Adam Purvis Zerks. Now, I cannot remember if this was actually a collaboration between Adam Purvis and or Adam Purvis and Bestech. I can't remember. So I'm sorry for getting that wrong, but oh my God, I loved this thing. It was, I mean, for the price point, it was just ridiculous. So cool. And the contoured micro-textured titanium, I love how that handle looks. Not everybody likes that micro-texturing. I love it. Love the compound blade. I like the kind of classy, cool, kind of aggressive, kind of, it's kind of looks like something James Bond might carry if it were not like shiny and stonewashed. This was so appealing, and the function of it, the snap of the detent, the snap of the action, it's one of those things where I held it and I was like, I can't believe this doesn't cost more money. Yeah, it's plain, it was just titanium and the M390, but just the materials are no direct indication of what the knife should cost. I mean, there's so many people who are like, I can get M390 and titanium for $150 through Tucson. Then buy a Tucson. It's never going to be the same thing, you know, and I'm not trying to preach, buy what you like, but if you've never handled a knife that's more expensive and does have a lot of these elements that I'm describing, speaking to you as somebody who has handled these, I can tell you definitively there is a huge difference, regardless of whether or not the knives are using the same materials. Knives that have more care and attention, more precision milling, more precision just fitment in general, there is a huge difference in the feeling. Whether or not you value that extra stuff is another point entirely. You can value whatever you want. In this case, the A Purvis Zerks, well deserving of the price tag, and I honestly would have paid more money for it. Moving on here, this is one I still currently own. This was a gift to the channel by my good friend Jeff Goodnow. This is the Protec Strider SG Auto, but this one is in titanium. I love the Strider SG for how it looks and its ergonomics. I love the idea of an automatic version of that, but I love this one especially because something that we don't see in the side-opening automatic knife world are titanium automatic knives. Most of them are aluminum. There's some weird stuff out there. Sometimes it's carbon fiber and G10, whatever. But I just don't see very many titanium ones. And so this titanium automatic, I mean, this was essentially everything I wanted in a Strider, which was full tie, right? It's got the external stops, got the ergos I like, right? This was in 154 cm, which I know a lot of you are like, oh my gosh, 154 cm on a knife like that, that's probably really expensive. Yeah, these were $500, right? But again, materials not really where I'm basing the foundation of value here, and value's out the window anyway. I love 154 cm. It's one of my favorite, if not my very favorite user steels of all time. And so the combination of all these things, I still have this knife today. I love it. I carry it. I use it. I still baby it a little bit, but God, I love this thing. Moving on here, the Konig areas, of course, this is like a lot of people's favorite, favorite knives. So this is an expensive knife, and when I reviewed it, they were more available. They are very hard to find now. Excellent slicing geometry. I mean, this is just an example of what the production knife, like the ultra high end of the production knife world, is capable of producing. These are US made knives. They are very expensive. I think these come in at base around $550. They definitely go up from there. What's the difference between this and other titanium frame lock folders that are in M390? This is substantially more precision made. Every last inch of this knife, care and attention was taken into, basically its ultimate form. Ergonomically, it's excellent. Fidget factor is awesome. Flipping action is excellent. It's got the completely and totally frictionless fall shut action. The little opening hole there allows you to do the kind of reverse flick or whatever. But this is another knife where it's an experience, right? It's a big knife, 8.5 inches. But then you hold it, and that new internal milling, well, I say new, the original versions of this didn't have internal milling in this, and on these full titanium variants, the milling they do is substantial. So you look at this and you think, full titanium, I bet that's a heavy knife at 8.5 inches, and you pick it up and you're like, wow, it almost feels featherweight. And for me, a knife that big that still falls into my preferable weight range, which I think these ended up being 4 to 4.5 ounces in the full titanium variants that are milled, it's just an experience thing. It's wonderful. Everything just feels like an organic extension of your hand, and I love it. Moving on here, another exact same category. It's a different design, different looking knife, but same idea as the Konig Arius. This is the Holt Spectre, in this case the V4. I like this more than the previous versions because it does not have an exposed frame lock. It's a countersunk titanium liner lock, which I've honestly come to realize is a preferred lock for me. I like the thumb manipulation of the lock, essentially what I learned to love about the titanium frame lock, except what I don't like about exposed titanium frame locks is that the harder you squeeze it during use, the more you affect the percentage of lockup, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You are sort of holding it in place. But not only does that not happen with a countersunk liner lock, also, you don't have to worry about where your fingers are when you're flipping it, right? If you accidentally apply pressure to an exposed frame lock, it's going to make it really hard for that blade to deploy. On a countersunk liner lock, you can't touch it because the scale is on top of it, the titanium scale. So it just, no matter what, it's going to flip. This is, for people who really like a simplistic, straightforward design, which isn't for everybody, but it is something that I really like. This is even more featherweight feeling versus the size of it. It honestly is surprisingly much larger than I would have thought. These are like 8.1, 8.2 inches overall with, I think, 3.5 or 3.6 inches of blade. I love the contouring on the titanium. I love the hardware choice. I mean, truthfully, this is one of those knives where I reviewed it and I was like, there's basically nothing wrong. There's nothing I would change about this knife. Fully flat ground blade, and it is an absolute laser beam. It's just one of those things where they took, you know, a good design, you know, not necessarily a completely and totally unique profile, but they took it and then took everything that today's modern knife world, or the technology that it has at its disposal, and threw it all into one knife and just created this, this shining golden god of a utility cutting tool that has all the luxuries that we want to see. All right, enough with the poetic and complicated dialogue. Moving on here, the TAD Dauntless. This is a much older knife. The one that I handled was a V3, and it's still going on this list. The V4, the newest variant, is contoured. These come in G10 and titanium, or all titanium. The one that I handled here was an all-tie V3. It just has that excellent, I mean, you can kind of see some Strider, kind of see some Hinderer, right? And actually, the funny thing is that Triple Aught Design, which is what TAD stands for, actually did collaborate with Hinderer to make a Hinderer Dauntless, and Strider to make a Strider Dauntless, as well as countless other makers that were involved with this. This is just the plain Dauntless. Love the blade shape, love the fuller, love the positioning of the thumb studs, love the giant oversized forward choil. I love the simplistic look. I love the idea of field adjustments with that flathead pivot there. It's just straightforward. No pomp and frill like the Konig Arius or the Holt Spectre V4, but just straightforward function. This runs on phosphor bronze, and as far as like just carrying a premium utility cutting tool that is set up to stand the test of time, the TAD Dauntless is excellent. They are very hard to get a hold of. They do not come out often, and when they do, they are super small batch. So if you're lucky enough to own one of these, or happen across an opportunity to buy one, if it's in good shape, my suggestion is go for it, because it's one of my favorite knives ever. Moving on here, the new Les George VECP Flipper. The standard VECP was my favorite Les George design of all time, with just the thumb studs, not the flipper tab. And it would have made this list had it not been for this flipper variant of this knife. This is essentially an updated VECP. It's got the flipper tab. It's got, in this case, some excess, like, interesting milling on the titanium. But this has bearings. It still has that weird glassy smell. Like, I'm not talking about the pivot. I'm talking about the finish on the blade and the scales. You can't tell from here. It just looks like a, you know, plain tumbled blade and some tumbled, slightly polished scales. Whatever Les George is doing to get the glassy, smooth surface of the blade and the scales, it almost doesn't feel real. It almost feels like glass, like I'm holding a glass object that's actually made of titanium. It's weird on the senses, but it's something that I like, and it's something that the internal part of my brain that determines quality, which is unique for everybody. It's something that I pick up on, and I notice it in all the Les George mid-techs that I've ever had. I've never handled a custom. I'm sure they're better. But these oh my gosh, I've handled the VECP and the Talos, and now this VECP Flipper and the Eagle, is it the Eagle Rock? I can't remember what that one is. The other Flipper. But God, I love this one. This is my favorite Les George design that's ever been. It is definitely still an American mid-tech, and it is definitely still expensive at something like $400, $450. Periodically, they become available. I think I read somewhere that Les George is trying to make these substantially more available than previous versions of the VECP. I think you can check them out on his website. But yeah, definitely one of my favorites. Moving on here, another Riot, the Riot New Epoch. Many times I had been tempted to either buy this knife or trade for it, because it has, once again, many elements that I appreciate in Hinderer knives. In fact, this knife reminds me of basically a no-choil Spanto, Hinderer XM18, which is a DLT trading exclusive. This is M390 and titanium, has exactly the guillotine flipping action that you would expect from Riot. In fact, this is a super guillotine. It's one of the most false shut action Riots that I've ever handled. But it has a Damascus inlay. Some people like that. Some people don't. Some people think it's out of place. I like it. I know exactly what I'm looking at when I look at this thing. There are very few parts of this knife that I didn't like. In fact, even off the top of my head, I honestly can't remember anything that I specifically didn't like. This is, I mean, if you guys are seeing a trend here, like all of my internal tastes are coming out in these images. You guys can probably tell I like monochromatic, you know, stonewashed titanium, even though what we're looking at here is a burst of color in that Damascus inlay. I like large fasteners. I like knives that are around the 8 to 8.5 inch mark. You're right. I mean, this is everything that I always say. I like knives that weigh somewhere between 4 and 6.5 ounces. You know, a lot of these are a little bit outside of those, but for the most part, this is what you're looking at. This is where my tastes come from, and this is no exception. M3, actually, I think these are 204P blades. Can't remember. Wonderful, wonderful knife. I think you can still buy these. I'm not 100% sure. Moving on here, of course, the Hinder XM24. Look, if you're new to Hinderer knives, do not start with the XM24. Number one, this thing is very expensive. $600 in its base form. It is essentially a titanic, hulking version of all the other Hinderer knives. It's even bigger than the full track. This is a monstrous knife. It honestly, it feels like you're wielding a broadsword. Huge. Very, you think the Hinderer XM18's flipper tab is uncomfortable? This thing's even more uncomfortable. The whole thing is thicker, heavier, chunkier, but that's why I love it. It's still a Hinderer. It's just like somebody fed just pumped steroids into the XM18 3.5 inch. And yeah, I like it. I mean, it's got its faults for sure. Is it worth $600? Yeah, that's up to you. I went ahead and paid for it. And I still own this knife. This is my dark horse. I took this picture a while back, and I outfitted it with a carbon fiber scale and some black hardware, so now I've got even more money in it. But yeah, I love this thing. Despite its quirks, it is still one of my favorite knives of all time. I just love it. I can't explain it. It's just this weird attraction that I have to this monstrous, like, in my opinion, totally unnecessary knife. It's plenty capable, and I'm sure it'll last until, you know, the end of time, but I just love it. Excellent knife. Moving on here. Yeah, this is one of the oldest knives that always makes this type of list for a number of different reasons. This is the ZT0392. Look, I've talked about this knife into the ground. This is the greatest knife that ZT has ever come out with. This was a collaboration between Brick Hinderer and Zero Tolerance to bring the Hinderer Eclipse into a production variant, a factory custom through ZT. At the time, good luck getting an actual Hinderer Eclipse because you could not get them. So they essentially created a full titanium production variant that was produced by ZT. It had, it was almost exactly the same thing as the Eclipse, except that it ran on bearings, which was not a thing with Hinderer at the time. It had a steel lock bar insert, which was not a thing with Hinderer at the time. And it was full titanium, which was not something that the original Eclipse came with. But it did include factory custom hardware from Hinderer knives. The hardware is actually Hinderer hardware. It also had a 204P blade, which was not a steel that Hinderer was using. They were using S35EN primarily, mostly CTS XHP and S35EN. Every now and then you'd find a Duratec 20CV blade, which is actually what used to be CPM 20CV. It used to be Duratec 20CV. But yeah, these came in a number of different blade shapes and styles. These go for substantially more money than they used to. They used to be about $390 through ZT's factory custom program. If I could go back and buy one or multiple of these for $390 today in 2020, would I do it? Yeah, you bet. I absolutely would. These are incredible knives, and again, the very best thing that ZT has ever produced, in my opinion. Moving on here, the Strider SG. Now, what we're looking at here is a custom. I've handled the PT, the SNG, the SMF, actual Striders. I've handled the Protec variant, right? And I've handled a custom. This was the custom that I handled. I just really like Strider's ergos. This one was far and away the most impressive one. It was also far and away the most expensive one. This knife being valued probably somewhere between $2,500 and $3,000. It's got a Groot finish on the scales, and yes, that is a reference to Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy, or at least I can assume. I think we can all assume that that looks like Groot on the scales. And then it had this very odd, sort of aged, like, just apocalyptic worn metal flat on this thing. The biggest visual draw is, of course, the compound or nightmare ground blade, where you have this very odd, very thinly ground scallop initially right after the sharpening choil, and then you have this thick secondary grind up that leads out to the tip. God, I love this thing. It's just, it's so ridiculous, but you look at it and you think, how could that ever, and then you get it in hand, you're like, oh, actually, yeah, I could totally use that. I mean, what would you use the custom? Probably not. Maybe some people would, I don't know. Is the scalloped blade something that's going to give you an advantage in a utility scenario? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. This is just something that brought me joy. Just continuous, perpetual joy. I love the Strider SNG. Moving on here, oh my goodness, the Shirograph Quantum. Taking it a step further than the Konig Arius or Aris, whatever, and the Holt Spectre V4, taking it a step further in precision production manufacturing, right? And after reading about what goes into a Shirograph knife, I can tell you guys there's a lot more handwork, a lot more manual process. A lot of people are like, you know, Shirographs are nice, but, you know, they cost like $1,000 and they're just production knives. If you want to know what goes into a Shirograph, go back to my review of this, and I say I have a link down in the description where it talks about every last little process that goes into a Shirograph knife. These are not 100% production. There's a lot. Mid-tech wouldn't even be doing it justice. There's so much excess that goes into just grinding that. They do hand grind these blades, as far as I understand. The tumbling is even like a much more elongated process, a much more controlled and precision process. The hardware is a lot more complicated to make, and on top of that, all of that aside, even if you read that, you know, and you're like, I'm still not convinced, if you ever get a chance to handle one of these and you experience the action, this knife has the very best action of any knife that I have ever handled in my life. And I judge that based on basically a frictionless feeling inside of the pivot. I still want it to drop on its own, but I want it to be controlled so that it doesn't chop my fingers off, right? I don't necessarily want a blade that's going to fall, that's going to be pulled down seemingly by, you know, excess gravity, like the Grimsmo Norseman. It's cool, but it's too much. This thing is like the smooth second hand on a super premium watch, just falling at the exact same speed. It's so controlled. That multi-row bearing system and whatever they do on the inside of the pivot is accentuated. You know, when you use this knife, when you flip it, when you disengage the lock bar and feel it fall back in. Anyways, I could go on and on. This is wonderful. Al the Science Pal, thank you for letting me experience this one, buddy. This was excellent. Moving on here, much in the same caliber. Just a little bit more angular, a little bit more aggressive. For anybody who doesn't know, the Shirogravs are made in Russia, and so are CKF, or Custom Knife Factory knives. This is a collaboration between Peter Rezenti and CKF, or Custom Knife Factory, the Snafu 2.0. God, I honestly like the aesthetic of this a little more than the Quantum. It's a little more fall shut, though. It's very, very smooth. It's very glassy, frictionless, blah, blah, blah. Just a little less controlled. Ergonomically, I enjoy it. It's a little more angular, but it's got its own thing going on. Between this and the Quantum, I prefer the Quantum for the action, but I prefer this one for just the aesthetic lines. It's very, very beautiful. It's also a little bit less money. I think they may outsource some of their hardware and things. Maybe that's why, maybe some of the processes, right? Maybe that's why it costs a little less. The Quantum comes in at about $1,100. These things came in $700. I can't remember. $650, $700. I can't remember. Don't take anything I'm saying as absolute fact. This is from memory, and a lot of it's my opinion, right? But yeah, still though, the manufacturing quality on this thing is excellent. Perhaps there are less manual processes in the overall production of this knife. Maybe that's how they save some money. I don't know. You could call it greed if you want to, whatever. You know, on Shirographs, and I don't think that's the case. But in any case, it was a very similar experience. It's just a totally different attitude with this knife, and I was very much drawn to it. And it will likely stay a top contender on this list in the future, because, guys, I'll update this list at least once a year. I handle so many knives, I can't not update this list, right? So that's where we're at. Love this knife. Moving on here, yeah, this is one of the only images that is not mine. This is actually a Beg Knives image. I know those guys fairly well, actually. The reason that I came to be in a position where I could handle this knife is because my buddy David, very early on in the channel, became interested in knives as I, you know, kind of explored this more for myself. David has the means of acquiring pretty much whatever he wants, so he started off with a Spyderco, Manix 2, then he immediately jumped to a Hinderer XM18, and then to a custom bugatti, a $2,500 custom bugatti, and that's how I got to handle this. The one that I handled was identical to this, other than the frame not being blasted or tumbled right. It was a black ice finish, so in my opinion, even more visually striking. This is essentially just like how the XM24 is a steroid-fed XM18, the bugatti is a steroid-fed Bodega. This thing is monstrous at 1/4 inch on the stock, double fullers, compound ground, mirror polished CTS XHP blade, unbelievably smooth, completely and totally fall shut, but probably the most dangerous guillotine on this list because it's got the frictionless pivot and the weight and mass of the blade working together. You have to get your fingers out of the way of this thing. On top of that, we have these, it's like some sort of polymer sealed, it's like a lightning strike carbon fiber. I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's like a special star strike carbon fiber, I think maybe is what we call this. It's got the copper weave inside the carbon fiber, and then it's laid into the titanium and has this polymer sealant that they polish. So that whole thing is mirror polished. And then you can just barely see it on the pocket clip, the cracked ice finish, which in this case was applied to the entirety of all the gray parts of the frame and the pocket clip, and it was black. So you'll just have to imagine that with me. But anyways, he picked this up and I got to handle it. It was one of my earliest videos on the channel. You can go back and watch that if you want. You can tell I basically had no idea what to do with it. This thing it was just one of those objects where I was just awed by it. It was unreal. It's crazy. To this day, it's one of the craziest knives I've ever handled, and it will probably remain on this list for a long time. You know, it's been on the list before, and it's going to stay here. Moving on, of course, the Hinderer XM18 3.5 inch. In this case, this is my current one, the only other Hinderer I currently own. This is the DLT Trading exclusive non-flipper Fullard Spear, which is, to date, my favorite variant of the XM18 that has ever been. I've got a lot of, blade shapes that I enjoy, and this is the 27th Hinderer knife and probably the 17th or 18th XM18 that I have owned. I generally enjoy them for a bit, then I sell them, and then I buy something else. These things retain their value pretty well, right? This has got the upgraded titanium scale. I say upgraded. To me, it's an upgrade. You have to buy those separately, but they are made by Hinderer. I love the monochromatic look. This is more of what I like, more of what you're seeing in some of these other knives. It just has the right balance. With the lack of a flipper tab on this guy, it solves a lot of issues. You don't have to worry about the sharp landing zone because you're not flipping it, right? You're using the thumb studs to open it, or the fuller in this case. Ergonomically, it's much better because you're not confined to a small space up in the forward choil because the flipper tab isn't there. Also, is the detent too heavy to use the thumb studs on your flipper? Well, on the non-flippers, it's lightened up a bit, so it's much easier to use that. And on top of that, with this fullard version, you can actually use the fuller to reverse flick it. So this is the most fidgety XM, and I've come to really appreciate fidget factor, so that's something that I just love. The Hinderer XM18 will always be on this list. The only way that it wouldn't be on the list is if Hinderer redesigned or overhauled the XM18 to be something better than it currently is. Oh gosh, fingers crossed for Gen 7. But yeah, just rest assured, until that happens, the XM18 will always be on this list. And moving on here, the last one on the list, one that I have handled here very recently and come to very much enjoy. This is the Brian Nadeau, probably how you say his name, Sharp by Design Evo Typhoon. And these are manufactured by Riot. Brian Nadeau does make custom knives, but this design was so good. I mean, it's so aesthetically pleasing. But once again, Riot stepping up to the plate and bringing this design down to a more reasonable price for a lot more people. I think these originally came in, you were able to pre-order these and get these for as low originally as $300, which is insane. That's a lot of money for a knife, I get it. But versus the competition, even today, because this knife actually came out a couple of years ago. They did the pre-orders and they sold out. And only recently did they bring it back for 2020, which I did order, by the way, before I even handled this because I knew I wanted it. But anyways, being able to get what you're getting here, which is, it's M390 in titanium, but it is with Riot's precision and this very interesting detent. So it's not really a detent ball. It's more of a lip that protrudes from the, I think it's actually the steel lock bar insert. And it works like a detent does, but just in a different way. Anyways, the action's super snappy. It's nice and, it's just easy to flip. That flipper tab, some people like it, some people hate it. I love it. It just makes the knife work well. And just the whole thing, and every time I flipped it, it brought me joy. I sought to handle this after I had ordered mine because I thought I'd really like to handle one. From what I understand, there's no major change between this version and the new 2020 version other than some different inlay materials, some different blade shapes, and some different blade options like Damasteel and stuff, which I'm sure you could get on these maybe too. But those were the changes. Functionally, it was the exact same knife. So I thought, well, if I handle one of these older ones, I'm going to get a good idea as far as how much I'm going to enjoy mine when it finally comes in, which is still not here yet. I'm still looking at a month and a half or so before it comes in. And my goodness, was I overjoyed. Every last little element of this was wonderful. You can't access that little slot there to do a reverse flick or anything, but it's aesthetically, this knife is so, and this version of it is probably the one that I would have picked up originally with that. It's not an inlay, but you can get inlays on these, but in this case, where the inlay would be is just a milled section that's highlighted with that outer milling, and then it's like knurling or diamond textured titanium. Oh boy, wonderful. This is, truthfully, the Evo Typhoon is one of the most perfect knives that I've ever handled, and at that price, I know I'm not taking value into consideration, but this brings me all the joy of just the object without considering function and value, and then they throw function and value in there. The blade is ground to slice. It is a laser beam, and it is so light and easy to carry. The pocket clip is just perfect. Minimal hardware, good-looking hardware. No, it's not a proprietary pivot. There is a Torx head on the other side. Absolutely wonderful. Are we at the end of the list? Yes, we are. Guys, this is my updated 20 knives of all time. My updated top 20 favorite folding knives of all time. My list may differ from yours, but these are my favorites based on the knives that I have actually handled. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you at least found it mildly entertaining. If you did, please leave a like. If you'd like to check out my other content, I do, of course, have lots of videos of knives that are either expensive or inexpensive that I do or don't like, so check those out. And if you enjoy all my content, go ahead and click on that Metal Complex logo right there and subscribe, because there's definitely more coming. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a great day.